Hello, today's February 27th, 2024. I'm honored to have with me for the second time attorney and leading intellectual light, Ron Coleman. The culmination of which is seen on Twitter as Coleman Nation. He has an interesting video series of his own. I love it. I really enjoyed, you had your brother Adam on the other day. Adam Coleman was on, and there were some interesting discussions there. And you get great guests, and the discussions go far afield. I think you're a bit of a polymath. You may not want to cop to that, but enough of your brilliance. Let's actually describe. Let's actually indulge in it. What has been your major interest of late in the news, and what are you trying? What kind of change and opinion are you trying to affect?
Well, really, my major interest in the news has been the political legal machinations around the collapse of our legal order. It's very, very distressing not to see that people that you may or may not support politically or prefer politically over the alternative being found guilty or being sued civilly or any of the sort of stuff that's going on with Donald Trump. That is part of the game. Although it has become much more part of the game in the last 5 years than it had ever been before. And I would point out that if anyone who's familiar with Israeli political history will realize that a lot of this use of lawfare, particularly on the part of the government, the concept of finding pretexts to prosecute your political enemies was really honed to a science in Israel starting in the 1950s. But as distressing as that is, believe me, you may remember several minutes ago I started a sentence that doesn't sound like it ended. As distressing as that is, what's more distressing is the abandonment of norms by the legal system, by the judiciary, and by prosecutors at every single level with frank political goals, to the extent where the governor of New York felt after last week's travesty of a judgment against Donald Trump in connection with routine commercial loan transactions. The governor of New York felt obligated to reassure New York real estate investors and developers that, don't worry, what we just did to Trump in connection with conduct that every single one of you engages in, which is to give your own optimistic version of the valuation of property, which we understand that banks will then evaluate with their own underwriting departments and criminalize that. We won't do that to anyone other than Trump. You can trust. You can trust us.
Yeah, said Laurent Beria.
Unfreaking believable. So she, as much as admitted that it was.
Well, didn't Letitia James run on that? Wasn't that her platform for running for Attorney General?
Yeah,
isn't it? Beria who said, "Show me the, give me the man. Show me the man.
Show me the man, and I'll show you and I'll find you the crime." Yep.
Yeah, it's like, and then there's also the ham sandwich. I mean, we can't really discuss ham sandwiches in this context, can we?
Well, so ham sandwiches are every bit as eligible for indictment as any other kind of sandwiches for Orthodox Jews, as long as we don't eat them. It's really problematic, and to think that you have a judge and boy, if you wanted to throw up a picture of that creepy New York County judge, New York Supreme Court judge, who seems to just be like, how could you have any self-respect?
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to be Pollyannish about the history of the judicial system or of the New York State Supreme Courts. People have been railroaded at every level throughout the judicial system, as long as there's been a judicial system. It's an unfortunate reality.
And we got humans. So
I'm sorry?
I said we have humans up and down the road. So
Right.
humans are corruptible, as we make
Corruptible, right. But
and often wrong.
the frankness of what is being done now, the comfort that these partisans have in being partisan, there's no turning back from this. They are going to cause a level of alienation from the justice system and from the legal system and from government, unlike anything we've ever seen. And what's equally distressing is how untroubled people who used to call themselves, maybe still do, liberals are. Yeah. It's okay because they're literally living in a world where they're saying it's okay because it's Trump. It's just mind-boggling. So that has been to me the theme of most interest in news, separate and apart from things like what's going on in Israel.
Well, we're going to table that temporarily. I went to my 50th high school reunion. I graduated when I was 5, just last summer, and I reconnoitered with some people, and this happened. My high school happened in the Bronx, Horace Mann, New York City, and almost ipso facto, there, there's a huge crop of liberals. I was one, or leftist, whatever. I grew up in New York City, so I grew up, a Democrat. And what does Churchill say? Nobody young, not a liberal, has any heart, and nobody older, not conservative, has any brains. At any rate, leaving that aside, leaving that judgment call aside, I wound up in kind of communication with a few, my former peers, pursuant to that engagement. And one guy came up to visit me here. He came up to visit one of his relatives, and but he called me up, and I had it at the reunion. Oddly enough, a few people whispered to me, because I minimally, on social media and whatnot. They're like, "Oh my God, I love your stuff. I would never, like it or follow it, because I don't want anybody to know." They're all secretive. So there's about, maybe 15% of the people I met were whispering in my ear that they like my stuff. And I thought he might be one of them, because he hadn't said anything. And so we met, and since then, turns out he just he can't believe that I would vote for Donald Trump, et cetera. So we've had this kind of email, texting, back and forth. And he asked me a question I'm going to ask you on his behalf. He said, which of the 91 charges against Donald Trump do I, Randy, think are accurate? And I haven't answered him yet. And on Facebook, I posted his question just to see what my other friends would say. And one of them turns out to be another classmate. And he said, well, if you just change the name to Clinton, you would think all of them were. Now, I'm just curious I'm not sure I'm objective. We'll assume you are maybe slightly more. What do you think? What's the answer to those two questions, two-parter? Now, which of the 91 is he guilty of? And a subset would be, which of the 91 should have been thrown his way? And is it the same? If the name Clinton were there, would we be, thinking anything differently?
Well, I think a question like that should not be indulged in. It puts the people having the discussion on the defensive in a preposterous way. There are several problems with it. One of them is that your allusion to a ham sandwich before, the fact that charges have been brought against someone has never been more meaningless than it is now. And when you consider all the people who are in prison for having existed in bodily form outside the United States Capitol, not even having gone inside, on January 6, 2021. And were not only indicted or an information filed against them, or criminal information, but convicted and sentenced. Indicted is the lowest level of being accused of something wrong. And in 2022 and on, convicted is fairly meaningless, as is acquitted. If you put that list of 91 indictments in front of me, or 91 charges against me, I could probably go through them, but I would remind you that we had this investigation headed by the great Mr. Mueller that lasted about 3 years and spent tens of millions of dollars. They went through everything. And now we know in retrospect that the entire government was spying on Donald Trump from the time he became a candidate for the Republican nomination. And they couldn't even charge him with a crime.
But the whole predicate for their spying on him was this stuff that they had laid out. Basically, they threw the bird seed out, then they found some birds, and then they followed those birds. I forget what our coordination with Australia, whatever. What is it? 4 eyes or something like that.
Five eyes, yeah.
5 eyes. And so it's kind of like all this, double whammy, super mole spycraft, movie quality, where they lay the layer and then they make it a trap and so forth. But the guys who are doing the illicit trapping have not been caught.
They've not been caught. They have been, in fact, roundly excused or protected. It is objective fact at this point that they did this setup, that they lied repeatedly about the facts and about the intelligence community. So the fact that there have been 90, and by the way, 91 charges is such a fallacy. If you say, here's a person who applied for a bunch of loans, and again, the crime here is exaggerating the value of properties, and you're going to reckon each one of those loans as a separate crime or as multiple crimes, you can get the number to anything you want. You can have the same music notated as 4-time, 3-4-time. You can use whatever time signature you want and then break up the notes into quarter notes and 16th and 32nds and put your dots in for your extra beat. It's going to sound the same, but you're going to say, wow, look at this piece that has all these 64th notes. This is really impressive music, but they're all 64th notes that are sustained, and they're the same thing as what would be a whole note over. I mean, it is absolute nonsense. And when you have someone who is look, the New York State legislature passed a law to make it legal to retroactively extend the statute of limitations so that it would affect one claim by one person against one other person after that earlier claim had been dismissed on statute of limitations grounds. That's unbelievable. That's never happened before in American legal history. It's patently unconstitutional. And again, I expect legislatures to behave in a corrupt way, especially when, as in New York, they have been so overwhelmingly ideologically driven. It shouldn't be the case, but it is the case. But I do expect, or I did expect, that people wearing robes who are placed with who these kinds of claims are put in front of would be the ones to say, this is, again, I might have my liberal leanings, but this is massively out of control. Now, foolishly, perhaps, I've gone on the record and said that I believe that the $435 million fine, or is it 300? Yeah, that was
$364 million.
Well, there's the
judgment for Gene Carroll.
right.
That's not I thought that was 80 something. Whatever.
I believe that that the appellate division in the First Department, which I can't say I think all that much of it's highly ideological. I have not had great success with it myself. It can always be counted on to come down on the ideological side that you would expect it to. Nonetheless, the real estate claim against the Trump organization is so over the top, and the penalty is so over the top and so out of proportion and so unusual compared to similar claims that I think that, and the political pressure. In other words, I think even a lot of really liberal people have recognized that there's a problem here and that this is a threat to New York's business, to its commercial base, and to its reputation. They might not do it on the basis that they ought to do it, which is to say that this entire thing is a travesty, but there's so much going on in all of these cases against Trump in New York State. Let's not even talk about Georgia. That I believe that they're going to reverse it. I don't think it's going to even get to the highest court, much less to the U.S. Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. But the damage has been done. This is criminal abuse of the office of the prosecutor in places like Atlanta and Fulton County and New York County. It's unprecedented for national figures, much less former presidents, to have their records. I mean, remember, even New York's prosecutor declined to press charges when he was given this file. He looked at it and said, "You got to be kidding! This is bullshit."
And did Bragg say that?
Yeah, he did. He did. I mean, that's not a direct quote, but even he passed on it, and then they turned the pressure up on him. And it's interesting to note that you have these real mediocrities who have been propelled into these offices and who are therefore really subject to this kind of pressure because they have no other kind of future. Mm-hmm. Eric Holder, for all his scumminess and corruption, was a different sort of character. And he has made major banks since leaving the Obama administration as a fixer, which is what he always was. And he, I don't think, needed any kind of pressure turned up on him. He understood that his job was to do for Obama what these judges are doing for Obama and Biden now. But I still think we're talking about a different kind of phenomenon. It's just a disaster. And again, I'm always making this point that no form of government can succeed, including the most democratic, the most constitutional, no matter how you structure the government and no matter how you write the Constitution, it still comes down to being able to trust people who are empowered with special abilities, special powers on behalf of the people in public life. There's always going to be, and there always has to be, prosecutorial discretion because there's no other way for prosecutors to operate. It's literally impossible for prosecutors not to have a high level of discretion because to do so then you don't need prosecutors. You just need clerks. Even then, clerks have to still process things with some degree of human discretion. And then we have checks and balances. So that's the executive. Prosecutors are part of the executive branch, and then you have the judicial branch. No one's operating as a check on anyone. They're all coalescing to achieve a frankly and corruptly political goal. And it's a real shame. And I guess maybe I feel it more because I've dedicated my professional life to working within this system. And to see it just absolutely, and to see also the lack of protest from people who for decades we have told us that they are the people standing for
justice, liberty,
justice and fairness and even-handedness, out the window, completely out the window. And you see the level of cynicism, the criminal defense bar, where are they? The civil liberties people, where are they? Nowhere to be found. It's just, it's really like a version of Stalinism dressed up as a democratic republic.
Yeah, I don't think we're ever shocked when we hear some court in Venezuela, kind of allow the, Maduro's emergency statutes or Chavez or whatever. We understand that they are under, dire pressures and possibly their lives, and, shunted off in some camp or whatever. But these faraway places, maybe not so far, but, you just don't think it's going to happen here. There's somehow we've been blessed in a way of being, again, filled with humans. So it's going to be corruptible and corrupted at times and places. And obviously we wouldn't have criminal courts if we didn't have criminals. But I've had this abiding faith that kind of everything, kind of works its way out, that there is this kind of abiding sensibility. There's this Goethe wrote the book, The Sorrows of Young Werther. I'm trying to, kind of flip that around and make it the worries of young sorrows. George Schwartz, MOT from Budapest, I believe, has been very assiduous and careful about planting grass seed at school boards and district attorneys and so forth. Why didn't we think of that? Do we not operate like that? It seems, the left and the right, I think, have different rules of engagement.
Yes.
And I don't know why it's the I don't know if it's Marquess or Marquess of Queensberry, but I think endemically, Republicans or conservatives, they are interested in the rules and they're interested in following the rules. And so you're playing chess with the pieces on the board, and the other guy's knifing you in the thigh, and then you wind up tipping over your king accidentally.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. It's a profound statement that Soros recognized that in terms of the national political debate, electoral trends were favoring Republicans and conservatives. Governors, presidents, houses of Congress, state houses were really moving very much in a Republican direction over the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century. So he had the ability, or someone working with him or for him had the ability to shift attention to the tactical pieces instead of the strategic pieces. Having lost the ideological and political arguments, they shifted to the vote counting process and the counters of votes, and being unable to effectuate the sort of legal changes, the legislative changes that they wanted to. They shifted to recognizing that this privilege of prosecutorial discretion was an incredible weapon, they began this trend of electing prosecutors who would make wholesale announcements that they were going to decide what laws would and would not be prosecuted. We're basically having veto power over what was deemed legal and illegal, not just in an individual case. And that's the idea of prosecutorial discretion. Is I've looked at this whole picture here,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to use my discretion and not prosecute, but rather to say, I've looked at this entire societal picture here. And although the legislature has decided that X shall be illegal, I've decided that it shall not be illegal. I've got a better idea than the legislature. And here's the point where we make the mistake as conservatives. There's nothing inappropriate with us having a different set of rules. It's a better way to live, to be a moral person. And it doesn't mean that by living that way, I have to end up living in a gulag. Because if you're going to tell me that the only way for me to beat the other side is to also involve myself in, illegality and street fighting, I'm going to lose, because there's more of them, and they ultimately have no morals. But at so many junctures along the way, conservatives and Republicans who are more or less conservatives, and Democrats who previously had some level of self-respect, failed to step up. So in this prosecutorial moment, and you can even go back to when the Obama administration decided it would not defend the Defense of Family Act before the Supreme Court. Now, that act actually was constitutionally defective. And I'm not surprised that it was overturned. But the executive branch it has an obligation under the Constitution
To execute.
to defend the law.
Well, it's almost in pathognomonic of the name. The executive branch is there to execute the law, no?
Well, executing the law and defending it on an appeal are arguably slightly different roles, and it's a little bit more nuanced than executing it. But during Obama, we saw the Justice Department absolutely politicized and criminalized, and Republicans who at times had a majority in both houses of Congress failed to act, to do anything about it. Eric Holder refused to appear before Congress when subpoenaed. There were no prosecutions. When prosecutors at the state and county level started these wholesale policies of exempting categories of crimes from prosecution, that was a moment for conservatives to step up and do something about it at the legislative and political, which are not identical levels, and they didn't do that. So these things incrementally moved the Overton window, and with the public, with the media, in terms of what would be acceptable, what would we allow the other branches of government to get away with. And now the entire nature of the conversation has changed. And this also includes, explicitly racist, segregationist, but pointed away from whites policies and programs that only now.
Good racism. Good racism.
The good racism, which has technically always been illegal, and which Republicans have, again, stood by and allowed to take place. So this is not a matter of not playing by the same no holds barred rules it's a matter of even refusing to play by the rule book. And if you're not going to do that, then you deserve to lose. And that's fine for the people who lose, but we're also the ones who are losing. We're not running for office, but these people are supposed to represent us, and they have manifestly failed with all these things.
Yeah, and I think that what happens over time is that I mean, we have I live in a state probably politically similar to yours, Massachusetts, and I'm a Republican, and
you're the Republican. You're the Republican in Massachusetts.
Yeah, exactly. And so we get our Governor Weld, Cellucci, Romney, Baker more recently. So we've had the Republican governors. So we've been the less, they're just slightly less of a Democrat than the Democrats. But the legislatures are all Democrat. But after a time, this Republicans stop running. It doesn't seem to be any way of fighting. You just kind of give up. And so you're just dealing in this one party realm, and they can pretty much do what they want. There's a terrible joke about, how do you keep a lawyer from drowning? You take your foot off his neck. And I'm only thinking of that just because it's just a matter of how much pressure they want to put on our necks. And there's very little, we do. And so they I don't think they have to be ostentatiously horrible Democrats, although some of them are. I think Michelle Wu having her unicolor, non-white, good racism party for Christmas, although I don't know why they call it Christmas. Maybe they didn't. But we're not in the gulag because they don't have to, because we're so little of a threat.
Was there any legal fallout from that? Did anyone file any kind of lawsuit?
I don't know. But the case that maybe it's premature to talk about, but I'm trying to put a little pushback on Michelle Wu through other modalities. I think she has been a less than perfect mayor. She's not my mayor, though. Anyway, the good questions. But even so, when you go through the court system, you are not guaranteed anything other than just the same political. Oliver Twist. May I have some more, please? And the answer is no. You don't. So because it's just so inured here, and I think that it seems to be rubber stamping. Throughout the states, it's if you go blue, you never go back. It's like it just seems like there are mixed states where you can have a free and fair election, then there are states where they'll take Trump off the ballot, and will make things difficult for you politically, emotionally, and so forth if you are any kind of announced Republican. It's hard. I think you go through your various Kubler-Ross stages, but there's kind of this acceptance that you're just some little bit of a dimmy status.
You're right, and I don't know what breaks the pattern. It's amazing to think that after all the damage they've done to Trump politically, that they still feel the need to remove him from the ballot because they actually think he might be elected.
Right.
I mean, it's mind-boggling, but it is it's free. No one's going to. It's very clear that no one's going to face any consequences for these actions. The worst thing that happens is they fail, but no one will be prosecuted for attempting to interfere with a federal election. And it's it goes to everything. It affects everything. Or your ability to plan it for the future, your ability to build institutions. I mean, I do think it's important that people and organizations and firms make what efforts we can to fight these things locally. And as they come up, you can't walk, as you say, when you walk in states like Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey, where you can't even get a Republican to run. You know, I met for coffee one of my colleagues from the Dillon Law Group last week or 2 weeks ago when I was in California for a Ninth Circuit argument in Pasadena, and Mark Moiser, this is actually how his name is pronounced, Mark Moiser, who ran for Senate as the Republican nominee. He was the nominee. No one knows who he is. He didn't exist. He lost handily. It's just not even as if he ever existed, because that's what these one-party states have become. And what a lot of people also don't realize is that states that were traditionally understood to be red states have become blue states, including some really, really traditionally red states. And how's that happened? Because the people are moving into the cities of these states. One of the things the Democrats figured out is that the major cities of every state control the electoral fortunes of that state. So even if Texas is overwhelmingly, everywhere you go in Texas is pretty much conservative, as long as you have Austin and parts of Houston that are overwhelmingly liberal, that's completely changes the equation. And the amazing thing is, these same people say it's outrageous that big states with small populations, in the West and the Northwest, why should they have senators? Why should they have the same number of senators? You know, why should there be the electoral college? Let's just do everything by popular vote. They have no problem with there being senators from Vermont, though, and senators from Massachusetts.
Rhode Island.
Massachusetts is a big state, like, population-wise, but the whole discourse is messed up. And also, and meanwhile, parallel to this, there's been this attack on the educational system, so that you have an entire population, certainly anyone below the age of 40, who isn't unusually well educated, has no conception of how government works or is supposed to work, what the balance, the balance of power among the different branches of government is supposed to be, what checks and balances are, what the presumptions of innocence are, and then that inability to follow the basics of civics and the lack of any kind of meaningful moral instruction goes across all the political issues that come up. So you have, the sort of gross distortions of right and wrong that have taken hold among the population with respect to the Gaza conflict and the sort of things that happen on the supposedly elite college campuses, where it has been acceptable to abuse and taunt Jewish students, not Israelis, as if being an Israeli were a sufficient basis for taunting someone, but Jewish students are now terrified on many of these campuses because of what they're being subjected to as a result of Palestinian and Palestinian-friendly agitation by Muslim students, Palestinian students, Arab students, Black students, everyone who wants to impress the first four categories, and the faculties, which have been in on this for decades now. It's pretty bad news.
No, it is bad news. It's Herb Stein said that which can't continue doesn't.
But the question is, at what point? How do you define doesn't? What then? What? I mean, I will say this much: I do think we're in for a sea change in terms of what it means to be a graduate of Harvard. What does that mean to people in terms of the desirability of receiving a degree from Harvard, in terms of considering the resume of a graduate of Harvard for your employment? If what it means, I mean, I'm already seeing headlines pop up to the effect that companies are backing off from DEI, not only because of the political pushback, but because they're starting to realize that hiring unqualified or underqualified people is bad for your business. Who would have thought? Who would have thought?
Yeah. Now it's this is probably 20 years ago. My two sons and I were for some reason Charlotte Airport in North Carolina, and we had an hour or whatever between flights, and these big TV screens are everywhere, and it was football day, and I can't remember his name. It starts, I think it was John something. I think he's no longer with us. Anyway, he's a sportscaster, and he is a mousy guy, white hair, little tiny glasses, didn't have TV looks, clearly was never a football player, etc. And I had never seen the guy on TV. I pointed to my sons. I said, "This guy knows a lot about football. You should listen to him." They're like, "How do you know? You know him?" I said, "No, I've never seen him before in my life." So like, well, how do you know he knows football? I said, well, think about it. Why else is he on that, video? He's not there because he played football. He's not there for his looks. He's not there as any type of, filling any category or whatnot. There can only be one reason why he's there. He must, have some reasonable good analytics. I mean, I'm just thinking this guy is probably an analytic whiz on football. He's good with his predictions are X, Y, and Z, whatever. I since saw him a few times, and I was able reasonably to corroborate that, and so forth. But it's one of those things when you go in. There's a guy, the late Jay Saverin was a radio kind of shock jock, whatever. He was a very interesting political guy. He worked, I think, for Pat Buchanan back in the day. Then he was in New York and then in Boston and whatnot. And he had his, it's a tough thing to talk about in public, but he had his black ophthalmologist hypothesis or situation scenario. And he says, look, you got one good eye. That's all you got, right? And that eye gets hit. And you're going into mass eye and ear, best place for the most trusted doctors to have your retina operation, whatever they're going to do. It's going to take your imminent blindness and reverse it. And the doctor comes in, and he's a hugely pleasant guy. And he's, whatever minority you want to put in there. And it's like, you look at him, it's like, hello, Dr. Smith. It's like, hello. And in the back of your mind, if you're honest with yourself, you got this one eye, you're thinking to yourself, is this Dr. Smith? Was he there? This is where affirmative action is not necessarily a benefit to the participants in the marketplace. It's like, you look at Dr. Smith, you think, am I trusting my one eye? Is he the best doctor because he's at mass eye and ear or MGH, whatever? Or is he there for some other reason? And this is what the Harvard conundrum, where that you hollow out the institutions. We have, I clean up the neighborhood when I walk around the neighborhood. I have a grabber and I pick up trash while I walk the dog. And then all these branches come down. I bring them, I chop them up. I make, put them in the fireplace here and there. But there's some huge trees that look like trees. But it turns out you see them like during some winter storm, and a piece of them fell down. It's like enormously hollowed out. The bugs have been at it for so long. I just had no idea. I was walking under this thing for years thinking it was a tree. And at some point it stopped being a tree and it started being a home for termites. And I had no idea until some strong wind came along, and there it is on the ground.
Well, that's a very, very compelling metaphor. And it applies in a lot of respects. Yes, these institutions have drawn down their brand equity. They have drawn on the capital of their equity. And this goes across the board. This applies to the movie studios, which said, look, as long as we say this is a Spider-Man movie, it doesn't have to have characters, believability, consistency, narrative. It just has to say that it's a Spider-Man movie and we can make it as bad as possible, and people will keep coming. And we can spend $300-400 million making it because it's going to make $1 billion. So it's a win-win all around, and we can't go wrong. Guess what? People don't want the termites, and it's true with the credentials. It's true, with Ivy League schools. It's true with major media. I think I maybe just thought of my next book, or I guess it would maybe be my first book, depending how you count it. But I mean, that I think that's really what's going on here. Is there's an illusion that abundance that we have enjoyed, the sort of abundance that we have enjoyed in this country, with a couple of relatively brief breaks since World War II, would continue forever. And in particular, the sort of massive wealth generation that has been taking place in Wall Street and in the entertainment business has given elites the impression that these things are guaranteed forever. Either ideologically they believe we can afford to waste and lose money, and even to endanger the benefit of our clients or our customers or our viewers, in order to fix the world, in order to give opportunities. Because the only reason that certain populations, minorities or women or whatever, that they haven't achieved exactly the same thing that the majority of people in these positions have achieved. The only reason that hasn't happened is because of a lack of role models and a lack of opportunities, like Eddie Murphy in Trading Places. If all you need to do is clean up your act and get Dan Aykroyd's job, you will also find yourself very easily making tens of millions of dollars, because it's all about the contacts and the connections and the networks. We can't go wrong. So that's the ideological. It might be stupid, but at least it's ideological. And then there's the really cynical version of that, which is, I'm 50, 60. I'm at the end of my career. I've already done very, very well. I've got an equity interest in this investment bank, in this firm, in this, whatever the case may be. I'm going to hire a bunch of relatively incompetent or barely competent DEI hires, and I'm going to give them a lot of money. That's going to help us recruit more of the same, which will make me feel really comfortable in my social circles for being so progressive. It will make my clients happy in the near term, because they've given me a list of requirements that we have to meet in terms of DEI in order to continue being their clients. And by the time the mediocrity or incompetence of these hires comes out and bites our clients and our business in the rear end, I'll be retired. It won't be my problem.
Yeah,
That's a problem.
Unless it's the Florida International University bridge, the pedestrian bridge that fell over, or if it's a piece of a Boeing aircraft, or if it's Bud Light.
That's right. Well, but so then we have the other corporate problem of corporations being large enough and responsibility and accountability for mission critical components of the work being so widely distributed that no one is ever really held accountable.
Yeah. So
this has been a really upbeat conversation.
Yeah, no, I like it. I like it. So you are a First Amendment lawyer, am I right?
Yes, that is an area of special interest that I had the opportunity to do a lot of work in.
So let me just ask you. I think people may have a misapprehension of what the First Amendment is and how and where it is covered, what it covers, et cetera. On campuses, this question was asked me as well by a friend. It's actually an attorney, and he said I forget what the name of the group, the Students United for Palestine, something like that, was disenfranchised as a community or something like that within Columbia, and yet they are protesting on the campus. And he was saying, I understand their First Amendment rights. I said, well, I'm not sure they have First Amendment rights on a Columbia campus. And that is theoretically a private space. And if they've been disbarred, or whatever the word would be, as a group for their intentions or actions and so forth, wouldn't that cover? But on the other hand, it seems like, I know the UK doesn't have a First Amendment, but people seem to be able to do what they want to do when they want to do it. George Floyd riots were okay, and Sturgis motorcycle rally was not okay. Within
right. Well, this goes back to this abuse of the law enforcement power, and it happens in private institutions as well. So we see that someone like Amy Wax, who steps over the line of political correctness at the University of Pennsylvania after an extraordinarily distinguished academic career, or not after, but at the end of an extraordinarily distinguished academic career, is treated like a maintenance employee, whereas you have faculty members who feel free and do say the most outrageous things in the other direction and continue receiving, benefits. Again, it's one thing to say we're going to abandon rules, or we're not going to abandon rules because we're better than that. But if you're going to rely, as I think we must, on the rule of law, both in private and public contexts, it has to be consistent, and it has consistently been inconsistent, and more so than ever in the last 5 years. What has happened on the campuses, there has been little or no accountability for these virtual riots that have taken place. And as you say, you have student organizations that have been supposedly deprived of their approved status, but in every meaningful sense, organize and conduct their activities on campus in a manner that only approved student organizations would be permitted to do. Columbia is a private institution. It doesn't have to allow any protests on its campus. There's no First Amendment right to riot or to hold a demonstration on a college campus. But I mean, I remember as a young child, back when, even you were young, during the Vietnam War, being so utterly confused about why college students were being allowed to burn down libraries and isn't there someone there who's in charge? Don't they have to answer and the answer was, and one, I think there's a consistent failure to understand that, a lot of people on the right would like to blame the left, understandably, and also members of certain groups. They might be identified ethnically or nationally or culturally. You can expect that people whose inclination, whether it's natural or whether it's cultural or whether it's ideological, if their inclination is to push at doors and to grab value and power wherever they can, you can expect them to do that. But when you put in charge of securing those doors people who are supposedly not situated that way, people who actually are supposedly share your values, administrators of universities, principals of public schools, prosecutors, police, trustees of universities and nonprofits, boards of directors. These are the people who let these things happen. And therein lies the problem. This goes back to the greatest generation, which won World War II and then matured into mild-mannered liberals, not necessarily Democrats, but people with the best of intention, wanting to give everyone the opportunity to be heard and to have grievances considered. They really turned this country over to the left with almost no fight by mocking the protests of those who were more conservative than they were, maybe less educated than they were. All the things that people said, well, that's a slippery slope argument. Of the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, they were all accurate. Every single slippery slope has turned out to be very slippery indeed.
I wondered about the domino theory. If I were a Cambodian, under Pol Pot, I would think the domino theory was fairly accurate. If I had been in Laos in the 60s and early 70s, I think I would be in favor of it. I don't see that. I think the domino theory plays out one way or the other. The early upside of the Iraq War, I guess the second one, was that there was some attentiveness. It was kind of a proxy domino theory. But the Cold War was a series of dominoes. Things happened. Repercussions. Cuba sending troops over to Angola, Mozambique. There were basically proxy wars happening all over the world. I think it was World War III. Maybe we're on World War IV right now. But the domino, you're laughed at for mentioning the domino theory.
Exactly.
Vietnam,
slippery slopes and domino theory and all these things. And this goes to the elite institutions that determine the nature of discourse, and that's why the censorship of the internet is of such high value to the United States government, because the internet is a relatively unfettered, even today, relatively unfettered discussion format. You and I are having this discussion, and you are going to, in a short time, upload it to the internet, and as many as 14 or 15 people are going to listen to it.
Well, that's only because my mother's no longer alive. He's 16.
But if things go back to the way they were when you and I were, not even you and I, just going back 25 years, there were 3 networks or 4 networks. They decided what would be discussed, and there were, each town had 1 or 2 newspapers, and they decided what would be discussed. And that really worked out well for stakeholders, and the government is the biggest stakeholder of all. And that's why it is so important that only approved messages be, and one of the main components of the spread of internet censorship is the promulgation and popularization of the idea that censorship is a good thing, because otherwise something called misinformation, which means non-approved narratives, will be allowed to be disseminated. And up ahead of an election later this year, we're going to see a lot more of it.
Yeah. So, I'm not sure we any longer have the Miss America contest, but if we did, we could just change it to misinformation.
And of course, it would be open to anyone who identified as a miss.
I know that's, yeah. Well, that's the whole thing. I think we're pretty much rounding out the hour. I don't want to keep you much longer, but as much as you're disappointed in the law, I want to match that with a disappointment in medicine.
Oh,
we learned things in medical school. I mean, frankly, I remember even in kindergarten getting the sense of what, how boys and girls were different, and it didn't really change much. I mean, I learned more of the names of the parts and inside and out through medical school, but we're supposed to ignore that as doctors. I was signing in unfortunately as a patient recently, and asked me, not my sex but my gender, which is the same pretty much word. If you're learning French or whatever, they have the gender.
Right.
Basically there's two choices. There's male and female. I mean, the table I think is female for whatever reason. And let's see, I don't know, maybe I can't think of what a good masculine one. I think the roof is masculine. So who knows? I'm not sure where they come from, whatever. But there's not 57 genders, and there's two. And so anyway, but in this case, I could have choose not to answer amongst any of the other choices. And the fact that you can frankly have two choices and the third choice is non-binary, which is of course a binary conception, because you're either binary or you're not. I don't know.
Right.
It reminds me that when I was in Sunday school, we did the Wise Men of Coleman, and the two guys are walking along. One says, if you guess how many eggs I have in this basket, I'll give you both of them. The other guy says 3. He says, how did you know? But at any rate, I think that's kind of where that particular formulation, non-binary, is. I mean, it's pretty much either or both. Anyway, so final parting words before I give my little standard closing statement.
From me?
Yeah.
Unbelievably, despite all the doom and gloom and all the reasons to be pessimistic, I maintain that as long as knowledge has some area, some space to win, the truth will come out, because that is the way God created the world. And it is harder, as the fall of the Soviet Union taught us. And going back, and I've used this phrase several times, to when you and I were growing up, we all assumed wrongly that the USSR was forever. That if you were brutal enough and wicked enough and repressive enough, you could maintain power for all time. And it turns out North Korea might be a level of proof of that, but it's isolated. It's unique. It is truly awful. But at the end of the day, on any kind of meaningful scale, and I think the United States is very different from North Korea, we have to keep fighting and keep having conversations like this, and maybe they'll grow from 15 to 30 or maybe even 300 sometime. People or people continue to think for themselves, or maybe even those who have not thought for themselves before will do so, and we'll come out the other end.
I like that. For some reason I'm thinking the joke comment is, once you can fake humility, you got it made.
Well, I remember Ronald Reagan being quoted, once you can fake sincerity, you've got.
Thank you. Sorry about
that. I would never even try to fake humility.
So while I have based on your scholarship, I'm wondering, have you ever looked at the Yale logo?
I have. Oddly enough, when I was a young boy, my mother bought me a plaque. It must have been in a secondhand store or something, maybe to inspire me. I don't know really what her thinking was. And I saw that it was Urim V'Tumim, which was a sloppy, I learned later, was a sloppy attempt to translate it into sort of New Testament purposes, because back in the couple hundred years ago, it was very in for theological scholars to learn Hebrew, just to translate into Old Testament language Lux ad Veritas, which is the Yale, the Yale, as you know, motto. And Yale, we now know, of course, I was a child at the time, I came to learn that Yale sucks,
and
and Yale indeed sucked at translate. And Urim and Thummim is the breastplate worn by the high priest in the temple during the time of the first temple, which the leaders of the nation were able to use to ask God questions about how they should, big major decisions they should take. There is an aspect, obviously, of light and truth to that, but hopefully, as long as none of us has to get anywhere near Yale, we can, we have a shot.
Well, they say that the expression is sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I'm trying to work that into the new Yale motto, because basically it is there, light and truth. Lux et veritas. Could be lux for luxury, of course, but so ideally with the light you would get truth. So the sunlight is the best disinfectant. Get things out in the open. When people tell you to shut up as their response to you and they censor you, they probably don't have the argument. One, they're probably not following the truth. So I think that would be the converse. So I feel enlightened, and that's a luxury of you. And I appreciate our attempts at getting to some veritas here. If people want to help support my podcast, they can send money to me. It'll be indirectly. They can go buy my book, Overturning Zika. It's an incredible book. How do I know that? Well, I don't, but I have heard compliments. An old medical colleague of mine, hadn't spoken to in 30 years or so, maybe 20 years. He just came upon the book and he loves it. He says it's easy to access. It's readable, and I point out some of the incredible foibles, and he used the word misinformation that are out there, at how, like Mark Twain, and well, he didn't actually originate the quote, but he's attributed, that it takes, the truth goes around the world lies go around the world before the truth gets its pants on. And in this case, a panic and a pandemic can do that. I think people would be commended to read my book, because it is kind of the perfect, like, Fabergé egg of a panic and a pandemic, and we have enough time and space and distance. We're not politically charged as we have been with COVID over something like Zika microcephaly, which has not returned, and yet nobody has reformulated, reconstituted, questioned the original premise, even though it has basically a batting average of either 0 for 9 or 0 for 8, depending on how many years you go, and possibly maybe 1 for 8 if people believe the original premise, which was actually false, that Zika caused microcephaly in 2015. There was no background data for microcephaly. There were no tests for Zika, which is a dengue virus, and dengue had never caused microcephaly. Anyway, I don't want to bore you with that too much.
No, but you're making a super important point, and I actually I mentally went through the calculus and decided not to get into it. But one of the things I wanted to say during my discourse earlier was part of what operated to enable all these subversive changes in our system of trust and rule following, and especially with respect to the judicial branch, was this special pleading that was made under the COVID scare.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you have constitutional rights unless there's going to be a virus. Wouldn't that be the kind of thing you would put into the Constitution?
That's the whole purpose. That's the whole purpose. If people just had the First Amendment for people they agreed with, it wouldn't. And
that's what happened. And the judges bought it, and the Supreme Court bought it time after time after time. And
well, what did Franklin say? If that you can't really have first he said it's a republic if you can keep it, and also that I think the American experiment, the republic such as we had, was for a people who were maybe you can get this right, who were devout, sensible, and constrained. But I'm not sure exactly how he said it. Do you have the words?
Not on the tip of my tongue, but I have quoted it myself. And
yeah, so I just don't know
we're not there.
I just don't know whether the lyrics of WAP, which every kid knows, have really filled that say God-sized hole in their heart, as Chesterton might say. So
thanks for having me on.
Yes. Any last words?
No, those were the how many last words can a person have before you stop listening to them?
All right, perfect. Have a great day.